Hey everyone, so it's been a lot of fun watching the creationist community have a complete meltdown about my James Tour debate, enacting the most transparent train of damage control I've ever seen. Almost none of it is worth addressing, but there was a video made by an apologist channel named Capturing Christianity that merits a response. The host, Cameron Bertuzzi, invited an astrochemist named Paul Rimmer to perform an analysis of just two of the papers that were discussed during the debate. In typical apologist form, the chemist is Christian, and judging from his comments toward the end, specifically a creationist as well. You have to wonder why these guys are so allergic to scientists who aren't in their club, huh? At any rate, Paul did do a fairly good job presenting the literature, even though it is not related to his specialty, and he remained at least somewhat impartial through much of it, though not entirely. I will do my best to praise him where he got things right, but also critique the moments where his bias caused him to frame things inaccurately. As for Cameron, his bias is quite glaring the entire time, as he was unreasonably charitable to James throughout and seemed to simply be fishing for ways to discredit or denigrate me. This intent was so palpable that even though Paul clearly states how James was wrong multiple times and dramatically overstating his case, the comment section is still littered with brainwashed tour drones praising the two of them for dunking on me so hard. Anyway, let's go through the video and highlight some key points so everyone can see what went right and what went wrong, shall we?
One of the things that I like about Paul is that he's not like extreme on either side, kind of like Dave is extreme on the origin of life side, or I don't know if that's the right term, but you get what I'm saying. Like Paul, not Paul. Dave is one of the extremes, and then Tour, you could kind of see him as like one of the extremes, is like super skeptical of the whole origins of life movement. Currently, the current state of the science and everything. But Paul, what's unique about him is that he's sort of in the middle. So he's not like making extreme claims on either side. It's more of a balanced approach.
Right away, before the conversation even begins, we see how Cameron is choosing to frame this dishonestly. It's a conversation between two outrageous extremes, and Paul is the reasonable middleman. No, Cam, James is a lying apologist fraud, and to call him extreme would be an understatement. I am a science communicator defending science and exposing his lies. Referring to me as extreme is a deliberate mischaracterization to make me seem unreasonable. This has nothing to do with balance. I make no extreme claims. I accurately represent scientific research that James ignores or assaults. This is a bad start.
It was very difficult to get to anything substantive. I would say that there were two, maybe three ideas that started to be discussed that were fairly substantive, but it got off the rails very quick. And it would kind of get off the rails and then on the rails again a little bit, and then off the rails again. It's very hard to pick those out. It was hard for me to pick those out.
Though Paul will do a fairly good job discussing the chemistry later, this depiction of things going off the rails is dishonest. I presented scientific literature while James just screamed at me to play with chalk.
To be sort of charitable to Dr. Tour, I think he was the one going into this wanting more to discuss the science.
No, James did not want to discuss the science. He wanted to posture for his fans and unleash a barrage of desperate pageantry to maintain their adoration. James has made two very lengthy YouTube series on this topic where he does not accurately or honestly portray any of the science, completely ignoring almost any research that challenges his indefensible position, and just outright lying about the research he chooses to address. Anyone familiar with his content knows that he is allergic to discussing the science. The debate was no different. You are both pretending to be unaware of the back and forth that led to this, and how James has consistently demonstrated that he is not acting in good faith on this topic, so you avoid crucial context regarding his quote mining, misrepresentation of research, and slandering prominent members of this field. Anyway, Paul starts with some quotes and philosophy, which we can skip, and then he provides a presentation with some basics regarding origin of life research. Most of it was fine, but I have some comments.
And this is the method for building these for E. coli, and would be very similar for LUCA. LUCA means last universal common ancestor.
LUCA has nothing to do with this. We are trying to explain how a protocell could have formed. That's not LUCA, and it is dramatically simpler than anything that even remotely resembles modern bacteria. This is a straw man.
This actually it reminds me of at one point during the debate, maybe something else that I listened to from Tours, that he does think that we need basically like a sort of revolution or something major to happen that's going to take us from where we are in our state of ignorance to the sort of next level. I see that as like, I want to point to the screen, but that's not going to help the audience. Where it says major system innovation, I suppose that's where like we're expecting to have someone like an Albert Einstein come in the origins of life community to shake things up and propose a completely new, crazy way of thinking.
The idea that James is legitimately asking for some major innovation when he refuses to acknowledge the true status of the field is absurd. He consistently makes the indefensible claim that nothing has happened in the 70 years since the Miller-Urey experiment. Did you guys know that he says that all the time? Is that a reasonable thing to say? Paul, does that sound like someone who is genuinely seeking innovation, or someone who is denying 70 years of science that is inconvenient to his faith? He refuses to even admit that the field of systems chemistry exists, in his content and during the debate. I explained the basics of these systems. He started rambling about dead cells for no reason, and then just denied the validity of the entire field. James is hiding from this research. He has no clue what anyone in the field is doing, and he doesn't want to know. In reality, the past decade has seen remarkable progress in this field, with repeated breakthroughs and innovations which I've continually referenced and he ignores.
Is that the more that we learn about the cell, the more that we learn about the building blocks of life, it becomes more like the target is moving away from us. And so that's why he thinks it's like, it's not only unlikely that we're going to figure it out soon, but it's because, well, it's even more unlikely that we're going to figure it out soon because we're learning more and more. Is that, do you agree with that? Is that like what you would say is true of the state of things as well?
I agree with that in a sense. We are learning more, and that does change the goalpost.
This is not accurately representing what James says. When he says that the target is getting further away, he's talking about interactomes and CISS and other things that don't actually have anything to do with the origin of life. He is just describing the complexity of the modern cell, which is the product of billions of years of evolution. Paul is giving James a pass here. The target isn't changing at all. The target is a protocell.
High-level view, we need that metabolism. These reactions will not happen just by themselves, certainly not quickly enough to produce anything useful.
In showing complex modern biosynthesis, Paul is both exaggerating what the first life needed enzymes to do and also ignoring metabolism-first research, or most likely is genuinely unaware of it as he does not seem to know about systems chemistry. He is wrong that metabolism requires sets of enzymes. Research in the metabolism-first model has already demonstrated this, and it acts as a marvelous companion to the RNA world model for that reason.
So you need molecules that control the speed of those reactions. Generally, those are done by proteins, which are made out of amino acids. You also need some way to store information that gets copied when the cell divides and
replicates.
Yep. And you also need information on how to build these molecules that control the speed of the chemistry. And this is done by DNA and RNA, which are made up of ribonucleotides.
It is reasonable to say that life seems pretty unthinkable without both proteins and nucleic acids, though he shows DNA and RNA, whereas most researchers agree that DNA is not needed. He also specifies phospholipids for cell membranes.
And then you need to have some way to contain it. These are contained by cell membranes, which are made up of phospholipids.
This is not necessary. It has been proposed that protocells functioned with simple fatty acids, and this is backed up by a lot of literature. So nothing horrendous here, simply a demonstration that Paul is not intimately familiar with this field and thus is unaware of important details. Next, he goes through some pretty solid explanations, first regarding amino acid polymerization to yield polypeptides, although he mentions only wet-dry cycling and not chemical activation, which is the preferred mechanism.
Lots of prebiotic chemists talk about wet-dry cycles, freeze-thaw cycles. That's what they're trying to do.
He then goes over polynucleotides, although he uses DNA instead of RNA for his explanation, which again is misleading, as life almost certainly predates DNA. He also shows the wrong enantiomer of the nucleotide he presents, a trivial error. After this section, he finishes his introduction without actually getting into the cutting edge of the field, which is systems chemistry, as that is the area that studies how sets of molecules evolved to produce a living organism. Again, this is most likely because Paul doesn't know much about it, but it does sort of seem like all creationists are allergic to discussing Darwinian evolution on the chemical level. Anyway, on to the debate analysis.
Jim Tour writes some stuff on a board, and then Dave Farina insults him, and then he yells at Dave Farina.
James writes with chalk, and Dave insults him. Where was that exactly? Go to the full debate.
This dipeptide is one of thousands and thousands and thousands that would have to form. If you were going to make a polypeptide, you'd need at least 100 of these for a very small polypeptide. Mr. Farina, show me the prebiotic chemistry that would do this coupling. Be my guest. Okay. Yeah, I don't need the board. So this is my second prompt, so I guess we'll circle back to this, but
James writes his amino acids on the board as a dumb stunt to appear intelligent. Where was my insult? Nowhere.
If you remember the amine, that NH2 thing, and the carboxylic acid, that CO thing, have to hook together and release a water. Look at how many of those there are in each of these two molecules, and you might start to see why this might be a bigger problem than Dave seems to realize, at least initially.
And a bigger problem than Dave realizes. No, Paul, I know what peptides are, and I know the research that shows how they can form prebiotically. I'm the one who has actually looked at the literature on this. You already mentioned wet-dry cycling, so you are aware that this is well understood, and there was no reason for you to say that.
But unfortunately, Dave Farina, either because he just wasn't listening very carefully, he was just ready to jump in, or because he missed something about the chemistry, I don't know which, brings up a paper that's useful to look at, but is actually irrelevant to the problem that Jim Tour just brought up.
No, Paul, my papers are not irrelevant to what James brought up. I showed a bunch of papers about prebiotic peptide formation, which is what he was asking for. James did not explicitly say anything about side chains. He just drew two amino acids and showed them coupling. And the reason I started with prebiotic peptide formation in general is because James denied it was possible in all of his content.
You're going to do condensation reactions in water? I don't understand why some would suggest that you do condensation reactions in an ocean like this, in water. How can that be? Tell me about that. How do you do condensation reactions in water? Have you any references on these claims?
You are again either unaware of or ignoring the context here. James clearly knows he's been caught denying the chemistry in these papers, so he is just shifting the goalposts by starting with the side chains. So now Paul starts describing the mechanism in one of the papers I showed and acknowledges that this is prebiotically plausible peptide formation. Cam seems surprised somehow and needs confirmation, which Paul indeed provides.
But if you pull it off piece by piece in this clever way, then it does work.
And this is what was shown in the paper?
And this is what is shown in the paper that Dave is talking about.
Got it. Okay.
The two of them should at this point agree resoundingly that putting the word clueless next to polypeptides was objectively wrong and idiotic, since they are discussing one of many plausible mechanisms for polypeptide formation. Then Paul begins explaining the problem with reactive side chains. But again, nobody is acting like this paper solves any side chain problem. James repeatedly said no peptide formation in water. I brought papers showing you can do this, which he has consistently ignored.
First of all, I wanted to comment on, like, just because you disagree with, like, the title of a paper doesn't mean that you're calling someone a fraud. That is, like, such a strange move to make. I mean, he makes a lot of strange moves in this debate, to be honest. But I just never. That one was super strange. Like, it's almost like a sort of reaction. Like that's the best he can do is accuse someone of accusing someone else of some doing, being a liar or a fraud or something like that. When in fact that's like literally what he's accusing Jim of. So it's very strange. Psychologically, there's a lot going on with Dave. I may actually do some other videos kind of looking at that a little bit more closely. I'm actually pretty concerned.
Yeah, you could spend all night talking about that.
No, Cam, he is accusing them of fraud. He does it multiple times. He did this much more blatantly with the research of Gerald Joyce later in the debate, which you guys decided not to discuss for whatever reason. I asked James if the paper shows what the authors say it shows. James says no.
Do you agree that this research shows replicators that evolve by natural selection? Because it does.
No.
Do you?
No.
Oh, okay. So Gerald Joyce is a fraud. You're calling Gerald Joyce a fraud right now? You should be careful right now.
He doesn't copy DNA. How much of the DNA did he copy? You read the paper, I read the...
Fully self-replicating. Fully
No,
self-replicating.
he did not fully self-replicate it. There's not more than 10...
He is saying they didn't do what they said they did. That's accusing them of fraudulence, or at the very least, gross incompetence. The paper reports exponential amplification of self-replicating ribozymes. James said they did not get self-replicating ribozymes. He is saying that they are reporting false data. Period. And it's not the best I can do. I repeatedly showed research that proves him wrong. It just goes over your head and you're in denial about it. He's not disagreeing with conclusions. He is denying the legitimacy of research he doesn't like by any means necessary. Pretending I'm dishonest for exposing Jim's dishonesty is absurd and demonstrates your bias. And Paul does absolutely nothing to curb this attitude. Then Paul offers a completely ridiculous opinion on the chalkboard thing.
What was behind? What do you think that his decision was? Like, why didn't he get up and write on the board? You think he just...
I cannot answer that for him. I will tell you why I would not have gotten up and written on the... I actually would have done something on the board, but it would have been very cheeky, and it wouldn't have been very chemically informative. I would have erased the side chains and changed them to something nicer to work with. So even for synthetic chemists, even experienced synthetic chemists, writing these reactions is hard. And some of the most terrifying experiences I've had being part of, when I was working as part of the Sutherland lab, was just watching other people get up and try to write out these particular reactions in front of John Sutherland, who's an absolutely brilliant synthetic organic chemist. And it's so easy to make little mistakes. It's so easy to miss certain things or to get the mechanisms wrong. Once you get up on that board, it becomes absolutely terrifying, even for people who do this for a living and are some of the best in their field. I can't imagine doing this in front of Jim Tour, also a great organic chemist, one of the best.
No, Paul, it had nothing to do with making mistakes. It was because there is no point in writing anything with chalk. The schemes are in the papers, and they are very extensive. A little later, Paul goes on to show the scheme from the Powner paper, which he concedes addresses what James was asking. But here's a preview now. It's 7 structures and lots of arrows. This probably wouldn't even fit on the board. It would take the entirety of my response time to write, and there would be literally no reason to do that since it's in the paper. Paul, this is what you are suggesting I should have drawn for James, but didn't because I was scared. Do you see how ridiculous you sound by not acknowledging that what James was requesting was sheer pageantry? And no, it's not hard to draw amino acids on the board, which is all James did. It's trivial. Freshman undergrads can do it. James did it to impress his clueless fans who have no idea what's happening and are impressed by someone drawing amino acids. Shame on you, Paul, for not denouncing this dumb stunt. Anyway, we finally start talking about side chains, which means Paul will now look at the research I presented that does address the reactive side chains, which I brought specifically anticipating this objection. They skip past the first paper I showed, they skip past James lying about HOBT, and we get to the Powner paper. Paul begins to describe the mechanism in this paper and does a great job explaining it. He more or less acknowledges that I'm right in presenting this, and James is wrong about there being no solution to the reactive side chains.
So this is totally plausible that actually the exact thing that Jim Tour wrote out could work with this kind of chemistry.
He qualifies his stance by saying we need more experiments, presumably to soften the blow to James.
This is a plausible answer to the puzzle, or like to the, at least Tour's, the puzzle that he set up in the first clip.
I think that it might be. I think more experiments would be necessary to really, really validate it for those specific 2 amino acids, because the side chains might interact with each other.
Then Paul calls into question prebiotic plausibility of the sulfur species without basis, a typical creationist stunt.
The initial conditions are a bit uncertain. We don't really know what that sulfur species is that's going to attach to that nitrile and do all this magic work. We found some that do it, but we're not sure how prebiotically plausible they are, how many of them would be around.
It's a primary thiol. Sulfur was prebiotically abundant. Again, he admits we are not clueless, but it's just not enough here.
Then great, we found something that works in the lab. That's a good clue. I think we're not clueless, right?
This whole commentary neglects the broader discussion that we can get polypeptides by myriad prebiotically plausible ways. The wet-dry cycling Paul mentioned earlier, the half a dozen methods of chemical activation I showed, and many more. To pretend that we are clueless on polypeptides is a complete denial of reality. That James brought up these 2 specific residues for coupling is irrelevant. He has no basis to presume that these 2 amino acids were needed prebiotically at all, let alone that they specifically needed to couple. It's a straw man meant to obfuscate the stupidity he has displayed on this topic in all of his content. Polypeptides are still polypeptides no matter how many different amino acids they contain. That we are discussing all these different ways of getting polypeptides, and James still writes clueless next to polypeptides, is absolute insanity, and that you don't call him out on this stunt is unacceptable.
I think he defined it in his opening statement, but it was a really strange way to define it. But
you would have to define it in a strange way to say that we're really clueless about Origins research, actually.
Yeah. So
we got lots of clues. It's just
exactly right. You can have lots of clues, but it doesn't mean that you're like confident that you found out how exactly that it happened.
I will credit Paul here for stating emphatically that we are not clueless, and I will also credit Cam for agreeing enthusiastically. However, this should have been followed by an admission that James therefore lost the debate and has been completely arrogant in repeatedly making the claim that we are clueless all over the internet. After all, Paul goes on to say that the field is making great progress. The field is attracting money and new researchers.
I think, interestingly, though, we're accelerating in our exploration and progress of this. More and more interesting stuff and more stuff of real substance keeps coming out year by year. And you can tell because it's getting funded more. There are these centers that are coming up. More prominent chemists are starting to get involved with this. It's a real burgeoning field.
So why does James call for the halting of the entire field?
I think that the way we're doing it is so wrong, it's just got to stop. Radically stop. It's getting us nowhere. Because what I say is all of the origin of life researchers that are working today will die of old age before they solve this problem. And their students will die of old age before they solve this problem.
Why does James specifically discourage students from entering the field?
Why would I do this? Why would I do this and discourage students from going into the laboratories of certain people? Well, in my job, part of what I do is I work with graduate students and I keep them from going down rat holes, or they will spend a year working on nonsense if I didn't redirect them. My job as an advisor is to find out where those rat holes are, know that, and redirect them and say, you don't want to work on that. That's going to dead end right here.
Does this seem like healthy behavior to you guys? No comment on any of this? Were you unaware that he has said these things, or are you just ignoring them? After this, they just play a long section of me proving James wrong and offer no commentary. They don't mention anything about James denying aqueous peptide bond formation in his content. They don't mention anything about him taking issue with chemical activators for no reason at all. They just give James endless passes for his shrieking and constant interruptions. To reiterate, James shifted the goalposts to something not specifically relevant to abiogenesis, and even then, I still proved him wrong, and they are not actively acknowledging that. Moving along to some commentary on polynucleotides, this is Paul's best section, as he does quite a good job explaining the Shostak paper regarding heterogeneity in RNA linkage, and acknowledges that I'm right again in presenting this as a solution to Tor's objection.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you agree? Is that true?
It depends on what you want to do, and that's what we'll get into, because Dave Farina does bring up a relevant paper here. And I do think that Dave is correct, at least on this point. Again, we do have some clues.
He also brings up the fact that 2' linkages hydrolyze faster than 3', which would effectively purge strands of the wrong linkage.
There is a wonderful prebiotic way to actually cycle through the 2', 5', so that the water will preferentially attack those and break those apart, whereas the water can't attack the 3', 5' ones as effectively in certain prebiotic conditions. And so what happens is you eventually eat away all your 2', 5' connections and replace them with 3', 5' connections.
But he then loses it a bit from there. He is correct in pointing out the non-heritability aspect of these linkages, but the point he is missing is that we don't need to go straight from monomers to RNA as we know it today. There can be heterogeneity until something else is produced, maybe a protein-based enzyme that then makes modern RNA with all 3' linkages. In fact, the linkage heterogeneity bestows RNA with certain properties that are specifically advantageous. It says so right in the abstract. The melting temperature for the resulting duplexes is lowered, making dissociation easier, so replication activity is actually enhanced in many cases. This indicates that this type of RNA would have been a useful precursor to other biopolymers, leading to RNA as genetic information later.
In that sense, Tour is absolutely right that this is a very important and unsolved problem in terms of how you would actually build RNA.
No, Tour is not right at all, not even a little bit, especially because once again, just like with polypeptides, he wrote clueless next to polynucleotides, which is what all of these are, regardless of linkage. He is conceding that polynucleotides are made regularly, but then still puts clueless next to polynucleotides, and Paul does not call him out for that. Then Cam does a pretty good job of summarizing aspects of what was said, but because he's not aware of how iterative these processes can be, he ends up framing the situation incorrectly, and Paul confirms it.
I'm having trouble understanding this one. So it sounds like initially you could have mostly 3'5 linkages, some 2'5 linkages, and that be okay. But eventually you're going to need all 3'5 linkages. And so the question is, how do we get, we're not there. We don't know how to get all 3'5 linkages, but at least at the time being, we can get mostly 3'5 linkages, which does get you some functionality, but eventually eventually you're going to have 3'5 linkages. So it's it's kind of like they're both correct. So like Dave is saying, no, we have some idea. And then Tour's like, no, we need all of it. You're not there. You don't have all of it. So you have nothing, basically. And Dave's like, no, we have something.
They are both missing the point that we don't need to get all the way to modern RNA at this stage. An enzyme can do it later. Then Paul totally betrays everything he's presented and claims that Tour is more correct.
They are talking past each other. I think both of them are right on certain aspects. I would say Tour is more correct on this one in terms of if you really want to get to something that's capable of Darwinian evolution eventually, you can't have any of these sticking around.
No, Tour is not more correct. That's ridiculous. He put clueless next to polynucleotides, which is just more reality denial. Apart from heterogeneous linkage still resulting in polynucleotides, the research shows that 2' linkages are tolerated and result in functional ribozymes, which means that purely 3' RNA can have arisen later. Useful polynucleotides with heterogeneous linkages first, enzymes that synthesize all 3' RNA later. This is not the huge problem James is making it out to be, period. Since those were the only two papers they chose to discuss, they then move on to some general commentary.
As you can see, we've had to cut a lot out so that we could actually talk about the science. It's unfortunate. I mean, I was thinking like this, if they were able to just talk about this would have been a great conversation. You know, especially
I would love this conversation. This is what I would have hoped for.
What a surprise. They hoped for a good faith conversation about the science, but refused to acknowledge that James is the reason this is not possible. James is only concerned with playing with chalk, flashing facetious Lee Cronin tweets and pretending they invalidate the whole field, and other such blatant dishonesty. That's the point, guys. James has no interest in good faith conversation. If you don't see that, you have no business pretending to be offering a neutral take. You're both biased. Wrapping things up with some Q&A, this question was asked, which pretends that there are large grains of truth in Jim's script of lies. But I will credit Paul and thank him for admitting that James dramatically overstates his case.
So I think that he overstates his case a lot, actually. I think he's way too negative about this.
Although this in itself is quite an understatement, since in actuality, James is lying the whole time and pretending science he doesn't like isn't real. Paul should be using much harsher language than this.
And I also agree with him, and this is something important that often gets lost in these discussions, that he does think that someday we may really solve this. And I'm a little bit more positive about that. I think we're making inroads, and someday we really will have the solution.
Nope, he does not think we will solve this. He just says that sometimes to appear open-minded. In reality, he dogmatically states that abiogenesis is impossible, calls for the halting of the entire field, and actively discourages students from entering it. If James truly believed that we will one day figure this out, why would he be calling for the halting of the field and telling students not to enter it? Let me help you with that. James believes that God created Adam and Eve. He is ideologically bound to denying abiogenesis. That's why he works for a Christian propaganda mill that is paid to lie about science, even though that propaganda mill specifically hurt his career by tricking him with their descent from Darwinism stunt. This is his club. He's a science denier. He publishes countless videos entertaining even young Earth creationism. These two are ignoring all of this and giving James endless passes.
If you want to take that completely literally, that is entirely incorrect. So if he wants to say it doesn't matter at all, then that's clearly wrong. It matters for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, there are good reasons to want pretty much pure 3', 5'.
I said it doesn't matter that there were some 2' linkages. The ribozymes retained function. Then they pretend that the moderator said something meaningful.
Right? You have to say, like, functional can mean, like, I think the moderator even pointed this out, like, functional can take on a whole lot of different meanings. Just because it says functional.
He did not. He pretended that functional RNA has to be mRNA, rRNA, or tRNA. He had no idea what he was talking about. It's hard to believe that Paul would just nod his head here, since he knows he was just discussing a hammerhead ribozyme, which is not any of those things. Then there is this claim that the Shostak paper was presented against our agreement.
Oh, sorry, I missed the second part of the previous guy's question. He was talking about the paper being introduced against their agreement. So
okay,
that's nothing. Yeah, we not really much for us to comment on that. On if they did that, then whatever.
They didn't engage with the claim, but for the record, no. I sent it to him months before the debate. That was the original agreement, something he stated publicly in his video. He needs the papers 60 days in advance. He attempted to change it later during our email exchange, specifically because I sent him this Shostak paper that he knew would put a wrench in his nucleotide linkage stunt, and he didn't want me to be able to talk about it. That's James Tour for you. Show me the paper that solves this problem. No, wait, don't show it to me. I didn't agree to it. Pathetic.
But then I think they should have put their philosophy hats on and define what they mean by clueless. Like Dave didn't even attempt to do that. If he did, then at least from my listening through it a couple times, I didn't hear him define clueless at all throughout the whole thing.
I don't need to define clueless. Everyone knows what it means. It means without a single clue. We have many clues, as Paul confirmed repeatedly here. We objectively are not clueless. James says we are all the time, which is a lie, so he should defend his lies. He failed.
I do think that there are some places where the research does get misrepresented. Sometimes because Jim gets very, very excited, and so he'll overstate a little bit sometimes. Sometimes because he is an outsider in this field, and he will misread certain things, or he has a particular philosophical approach to the problem, which is very different from people who work in origins. And so some of his criticisms miss in that sense.
Paul, that's bullshit. I'm sorry. You either have never watched any of his content on this topic, or you're just lying. James consistently and repeatedly misrepresents all of the science on this topic. He doesn't overstate. He quote mines. He shows passages from papers and cuts out sections deliberately to make it seem as though origin of life researchers are debunking origin of life research. He asks for papers that address some objection and then refuses to acknowledge them when provided. When you say that he misreads and has a different philosophical approach, this actually means that he's a creationist who denies science he doesn't like because Jesus.
But whenever he's talking about the chemistry itself, usually he's pretty accurate.
No, Paul, he is never accurate. He can't read a 13C NMR spectrum and slanders the researcher that produced it. He doesn't understand basic protocol in this field, complaining about hydrogen peroxide that kills bacteria, running reactions under argon, and other aspects that specifically make the experiment more prebiotic. He says that the word spontaneous means we have no idea.
Again, this word spontaneously here is a code word for we have no idea.
He denies my simple explanation of how soap works to pretend I don't know basic chemistry.
This is not how soap works, as some have claimed.
Everything he says is dishonest. Watch my debunks, Paul. Go ahead and do some commentary on those. Maybe you haven't seen any of his content or mine. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But if you haven't, you should stop pretending you're totally informed.
How do you get life from non-life without intelligent minds? And then he just says the probability seems really low.
Yes. So I'm going to give a maybe somewhat unsatisfying but very philosophical or theological answer to this. Is I don't think you can get life without an intelligent mind, because I don't think you can get chemistry without an intelligent mind. I don't think you can get physics or a universe without an intelligent mind. So you'll have nothing there. You need an intelligent mind. I believe that God creates and sustains the universe in its existence every step along the way.
At the end, the core of Paul's worldview is revealed. You can't get chemistry without an intelligent mind. Paul is entitled to his religious beliefs, and they certainly don't seem to poison his ability to look at science to the degree that they do for James. But nevertheless, it is clear that they cloud his ability to look at the situation that was unfolding in this debate and comment on it with neutrality. This is demonstrated quite clearly with what Paul chose to discuss and what he chose not to discuss. Look at what happened when I brought up systems chemistry and self-replicating ribozymes. James just lied about what was in the paper and repeated the lie over and over again.
Fully self-replicating.
No, he did not
Yes.
fully self-replicate
Yes,
it. There's
fully
not more than 10.
self-replicating.
Show me.
Fully replicating.
It is not fully replicated. No way. It is
20-fold
not.
amplification.
They take a long bit and they duplicate this much of it.
James, how would it retain
But
catalytic activity?
even if they could.
Okay.
No comment there, Paul? Didn't feel like looking at that one, I guess. Pretty convenient. How about the tantrum he threw regarding enzymatic production of the polysaccharides he was looking for?
You don't have enzymes because you couldn't make them here. You couldn't make them there. No enzymes.
You didn't feel like chiming in to scold him? What about his entire fourth prompt being exclusively centered around the pseudoscientific concept of specified information? No interest in distancing yourself from creationist propaganda? You'd be a lot more credible if you did. What about James whining about how I scripted my prompts and repeatedly launching into childish outbursts about it to desperately deflect from legitimate points I was making?
Okay, I just want you to understand what the man has just done, and he keeps doing, is he's reading exactly the script from his YouTube video.
So all of
Clueless
them?
on origin of life? No. Does Farina know chemistry? No.
I don't
It's
know
like
chemistry.
You have
I
a
don't know
script.
chemistry,
Anybody
yet I
can
have a
read a
very
script. You saw it tonight. The man could not speak without a script. He has people write it. You
Yeah.
could do it. You could do it.
When
you
you
could do
have-
it.
What about him doubling down on his baseless accusations about how I don't know anything about chemistry? You're just gonna let that all slide, huh? Cam doesn't know chemistry, but you do, so you should be held accountable for excusing this behavior. Now over to Cameron. Cam, your approach to apologetics is very transparent. You want to present yourself as the rational apologist, the one who's interested in the facts, but it just doesn't play. On the thumbnail for your video, it says, "Watch this instead." The implication is that an analysis of just 2 papers is all that's necessary to know what transpired in the exchange. It's totally fine and actually commendable that you wanted to dig into some of the literature, even if it was just a tiny fraction. But a lot went on during that debate, and any rational person knows that James was an unhinged maniac, that you refuse to acknowledge his lies, his tantrums, and his pageantry is very telling. This is why nobody takes apologists seriously. You simply are never ever interested in presenting things accurately. If you want credibility, you should be denigrating James. You should be distancing yourself from him and from Discovery Institute in general. But you don't do that. You are charitable, you ignore his lies, and you craft your language to make it seem as though he is reasonable. And why? Because in the end, for any apologist, Team Jesus has to win. As long as you adopt that approach, educated people will continue to see through your pseudo-intellectual facade. Do better, buddy. I highly doubt you'll even try, but maybe you'll surprise me. To everyone else, I'll see you next time.